Some films were harmed in the making of this podcast.
Just in time, you found me just in time. Before you came, my time was running low. I was lost, the losing dice were tossed. My bridges all were crossed, nowhere to go. Now you're here, and I know where I'm going.
From Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, and the palatial FYC studio, you are listening to For Your Consideration,
the podcast featuring roundtable discussions reevaluating the cinematic canon of past masterpieces and modern classics. I'm your host, Dustin and
and I'm your host, Mike Josic, and we'd like to welcome everybody to the show. If you are a regular listener, welcome back, and if you are a brand new listener, just warning, spoilers ahead. Just a quick note, if you're catching the show on Apple Podcasts, while you're there, we'd love it if you rated and reviewed the show. It still helps with the algorithms for getting the show into the eyes and ears of people who may be interested in our particular brand of content. Now, having said that, as we probably discussed on our last episode, the movie that we were covering this time around was one of my picks, and it is the 2004 romantic drama Before Sunset.
AKA After Sunrise, AKA During the Daytime.
This time around, I caught it on my Blu-ray collection. There's a lovely Before Trilogy 3-pack that Criterion put out, both on DVD and Blu-ray. Lovely transfers, lovely sound. Highly recommend for anybody who doesn't already have it and is interested in the series. If you can find it, grab it. It's definitely worth it. And Dustin, this apparently was your first time watching the film?
Yep, and it's the second one, so I looked up on the wiki sort of what happened in the first and third just to get a general idea of how the trilogy works. The trilogy, 25, 30 years in the making?
The lowest grossing trilogy of all time.
Now, August Underground, come on. That's a trilogy, technically.
Actually, I think it's the lowest grossing film to spawn a sequel, at least at the time.
That we've heard of, that has a wiki page. There's always going to be an exception out there. Someone's going to have somewhere a list of, well, there was this Tanzanian film that was made back in 1947 that made $4 because it was just bring a kroner and you get to watch it. I don't know. Not even the proper monetary system they were using. It's ridiculous.
I'd probably have to do more research, but perhaps phrasing it as ostensibly the lowest grossing film trilogy, or perhaps the lowest grossing film trilogy with, wide theatrical release, maybe.
That was your pedantic sort of little side conversation brought to you by an asshole. The letter A.
All right, I'm going to jump into the credits, and we will start the discussion about the film. So, Before Sunset was directed by Richard Linklater. The screenplay was by Richard Linklater, Ethan Hawke, and Julie Delpy. The story was by Richard Linklater and Krim Kreisen. It was based on characters created by Linklater and Kreisen, produced by Linklater and Anne Walker McBay. It starred Ethan Hawke and Julie Delpy. Cinematography was by Lee Daniel, edited by Sandra Adair. It was produced by Castle Rock Entertainment, distributed by Warner Independent Pictures, and released on February 10th, 2004. As we said before, it is the sequel to Before Sunrise, a very modestly budgeted independent film that got something of a cult following, spawned a sequel based almost entirely out of sort of the curiosity of the filmmakers and the actors, and just wondering, what happened to these characters 9 years later. And also from fan outcry, because everybody wanted to know, what happened? Did they or didn't they? Did they actually meet up 6 months later, or did they, skip it entirely? And this film came out of it and is generally considered, out of the three, sort of the masterpiece of the three. Also the shortest of the three. I was amused listening to an interview with Linklater at one point where somebody asked him, out of all the movies, which one would you kind of go back and watch? And he was like, the second one. Probably because it's the shortest. And
not somebody who likes to watch his own films, I take it.
Yeah, it's a huge cult following. These are beloved movies. They are kind of unique in the place that they sort of hold with cinephiles. And, Linklater has a tendency to make movies like this. I mean, this particular film is done in real time. And, Boyhood was done over the span of like 12 years. Like, he likes to play with time and relationships of people.
I remember hearing about Boyhood filmed over, 12, 20 years, whatever. And the one thing that I always thought of is, what happens if somebody died in a car accident? What if somebody was just like, yeah, I'm done with this? And I'm kind of wondering if that did happen and had to be sort of written into the film at some point.
What car accident?
No, I mean, just sort of any event that would get somebody taken out of the next step of filming Boyhood.
Right.
I'm wondering if that actually did have to play into the film.
Critically, Before Sunset is widely celebrated, more so even than the original. I don't think it's won.
It's the Godfather 2 of the trilogy. The Empire Strikes Back.
It's made its way on a lot of top 10 lists. It's won a number of awards, including the Academy Award for Best Adapted Screenplay.
And as we are wont to do, it also ranked 588th on the critics poll for the BFI Sight and Sound Top Films of All Time, 2012.
As we have already said, this was Dustin's first time watching the film, and as we generally do, we start with Dustin's kind of first impressions, and I'm curious to hear what he has to say. So, Dustin, what did you think of Before Sunset?
Hearing your explanation as to why they made the sequel in the first place, because of the fans wanting to know what happened, did they, didn't they, so on and so forth.
Also the creators.
Also the creators.
Also Ethan, Julie, and Richard were kind of like...
I find that actually really hilarious, given that that's sort of what the film itself is about. As Ethan, he wrote a book based on the experience of the first one, and then Julie comes in later on, and they sort of talk about that for the first little bit. And I found that very meta. Very amusing, because they then discuss the did they, didn't they, and they discuss why they didn't, so on and so forth. And as any longtime listener of the show knows from me, I love something that feels real. And this film felt real as shit to me. And
not just because it was in real time.
Not just because it was in real time. Like, you could feel the awkwardness, the not wanting to discuss certain things. Like, rewatching it again, because I've seen it twice. I saw it initially back when, and then I saw it again last month to get sort of reacquainted with it.
It's taken us a while to get here, dear listener.
But like seeing the sexual frustration that both of them have, she brings up how French guys don't have much of a sex drive, and he's starting to brag a little bit about that, and they get a little handsy. Even though he's married and she's in a relationship, you can tell that they sort of just want to jump each other. But at the same time, one thing that I've always found sort of annoying in film is the relationship that starts over the course of that film. And here, even though they've technically known each other 9 years ago, they didn't have any communication other than one night. And now this is day 2. And they're going a little far. I think so much of their attraction and desire for each other is based off of essentially a memory, and all memories become lies because the act of remembering changes that memory. So they're living through this rose-tinted day, and the affection that they have each other is through these rose-tinted goggles of this one fantastic night that they had, that's really being compounded by the fact that they're both in problematic relationships. And they're both sort of feeling their way as to whether or not it's okay, is this gonna work? Should I cheat? Shouldn't I cheat? What's all going on here? And more interestingly is that because they don't bring it up right at first, it actually provides a narrative structure that gives you some ups and downs throughout what is just a conversation that they're having over the course of an hour, getting to know each other. Because for the first little bit, you don't know that he's married. So all of a sudden, boom, you have this complete change in dynamic. All of a sudden, there's something going on here, whereas in another film, it might be, oh no, the bad guy kidnapped the daughter, and now we have to do this, and this sudden thing happened. It adds action to a conversation, so I thought that was pretty ingenious.
It is interesting because the audience is invested in these characters, and these characters are obviously invested in these characters, and then you throw it like, you had the awkward flirtation and the innuendo, and like nobody's quite sure like where are the thresholds, where are the boundaries, because this is a relationship that was incredibly intense and intimate 9 years ago for one night, like you said, based on like nostalgia and this memory that's been lingering for so long. And then
The dude wrote a friggin' book about it.
and then which he admittedly says was to potentially draw her out.
Not at all creepy.
And he was also probably, processing it for himself as well. But finding out that he's married, it's an obstacle. And
Married and with a kid.
for anybody who's shipping that, all of a sudden you're like, oh, because the thing that you want more than anything with these characters is that they come together, but then that means he has to cheat on his wife.
But then later on, it turns out that there's actually problems in the marriage that he didn't bring up immediately. So if you look in the structure of a rom-com, it's, oh, she's in a relationship, and then, oh, now there's the kick the puppy moment, where all of a sudden it's okay to cheat.
And she also is in a relationship that is very distant and not as loving as she would like it to be.
Yeah, she didn't bring it up immediately at first, and we learn about those issues later on, which on one hand is natural because you don't jump into it shouting out, no, I'm married, blah, 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 because they have those issues, and when you're talking to somebody who you just had some wild sex with one night, that's not usually the first thing you talk about, a bit of a mood killer.
Well, they had more than just sex that night. The
I
sex
don't
was...
know this. I didn't
That's
see
right,
it.
you haven't seen it. For anyone who has seen it, you know that they had... That night was more than just the two of them, copulating. Like, they were connecting...
Twice.
Although
she admits or lies about that earlier on, and that's another little thing.
But one of the fun things about these films, too, and this is just a slight digression, but, I think that's appropriate when talking about these films. I mentioned the fact that fans wanted to know every time these guys were making a movie, somebody would ask them, like, did Jesse and Celine get back together? Did they? and that's even addressed in the book talk at the beginning, where Jesse says, well, what do you think? And that one person's like, well, I think they got together. And the other person thinks they didn't get together. And it's like, it works beautifully where you can kind of put your own sensibility into it, and it creates a complete story for you that you enjoy. But the fact that, fans wondered and would always ask them these questions. And, one of the questions that people would ask Linklater or Ethan Hawke, did he actually mail the bartender the money for the wine? Because for some reason that spoke to them about the sort of the integrity, I guess, of the character, and it would taint the romantic nature somewhat, because that guy did them a solid by giving them that wine. And even more hilarious, the answer is yes. Everybody says that yes, Jesse would have mailed him the money for the wine. But even funnier than that is the guy who played the bartender, when he saw the film, he was upset because Jesse and Celine left the bottle in the park. And he was like, they just littered, they just left it there. But that's one of the things that I find the most interesting about these movies is that they, if you look at them just on the surface, they're very talky, they're very, single camera,
slow,
steady cam, sometimes talking about nothing, sometimes talking about everything. In the first movie, it's these 20-somethings. As you get older with these films, like the 20-somethings, Before Sunrise used to be my favorite, and now I kind of find them to be annoying 20-year-olds who are talking out of their ass about stuff. And then I watched it again recently, and now I see them as 20-year-olds who are talking out of their ass about stuff, but who are doing so because they're young and inexperienced. And like, these movies take on different aspects as you grow with them and as you age and read things differently. But to kind of get back to the point that, Dustin sort of touched on when I jumped in, you have this dialogue, you have this wordy stuff that's going on, but it's all in purpose to sort of this not really tangible stuff sort of working in the subtext. And it takes you very, very deftly through these films, through these conversations, through these experiences with these characters. And it gives you the information that you need, and it doesn't spoon feed you. And I think that's really cool.
I was honestly, just as I said, amazed that they were able to weave a narrative structure into an hour-and-a-half long conversation. And I appreciate the fact that they didn't just agree on everything. They had differences on some major issues, and I could see it as conversations that I could have, because it is sort of conversations that I've had before, and you can feel longing for each other, and she's always worried about the time, and he's always trying to slough that off. That's pretty much the through line throughout the entire film, especially since that's the last line of the film.
You're going to miss your playing.
I know. And he just wants nothing more than to avoid going back to his quote-unquote real life sort of deal. And she's not too sure what to think of all this. And honestly, if somebody wrote a book about one night that I spent with them, that would be a whole heck of a lot to sort of process that she's working on. And she's not too sure how she feels, and you can get that sense.
She does address that in the conversation.
And it isn't until as I was saying a bit earlier, she lied about them having sex. She's like, I don't remember, we never had sex. And he eventually sort of reminds her, and she's like, yeah, I know we did. Twice.
Which is, again, great because it plays with audience expectation, and it plays with what the audience... Because in the first film, they're kind of vague about it, and they want it to be vague about it. And you can create your own narrative based on the fact that when you look at how Celine is dressed after the park scene, it looks like she could only be dressed that way if certain items of clothing were like removed and put on, again, differently. But that doesn't necessarily imply that they had sex. So that's a question they've been asked for 9 years, and then to have the character deny it and one character say it did happen, and then play with that whole idea of, memory being unreliable, and then to have that be a character thing that plays in. So it kind of plays on a meta level, and then it plays in on a character level and a narrative level.
And as somebody who hadn't seen the first one and didn't know about all this fan questioning and whatnot, it still worked. So it worked on multiple levels, and it also worked independently on those levels.
And I will admit, I knew Dustin hadn't seen any of the Before movies. And I know how Dustin feels about romantic movies and people falling in love over the course of 2 hours, having their forever loves. So I was really, really curious, and again, especially because we were going into the second film, and the other two films aren't on the list, so this was kind of the only one that we could ostensibly talk on the show during one of our regular episodes. I was super curious to see how Dustin would react to it, and if it would play to somebody as a first film, like if there was enough backstory there that they would fill in, that you could follow along and still care about these characters despite not having that previous, 100 minutes or whatever with them as they were walking all night in Vienna.
And I do care about the characters, and I was interested the entire time, which is always tricky to do with something that's an hour and a half long conversation. But I just end up with doubts about the longevity of the relationship because, as I said, it's based off of 2 nights. And they really don't know a whole heck of a lot about each other at the beginning and end of all this. So, I mean, if somebody said after 2 dates that they were getting married, you'd say you're insane. But after these films, all these fans are probably going to be wondering all sorts of things. Especially when the people involved were actually in relationships around the time of the second date. But you know that they're both just longing for each other, for this idea of each other. And as you were saying, where they're sort of playing with expectations, she doesn't let on quite as quickly as he does. And it turns out at the very end that she'd written the song about that night as well. So they're both in the exact same boat, and they're just going to get it on, whether or not you approve of that in the confines of the relationships that they're currently in. Which, of course, sets the stage for the third one.
And I love the fact that you address that question. They've only had 2 dates, essentially. It's been this almost decade-long sort of non-relationship, but it's very intense, and it's based on, some pretty flimsy but passionate kind of framework. And where we leave the characters, the audience, everybody was asking the same question for the next 9 years. And those are things...
Did they meet up in Vienna the way they said they would? And that's, of course, the first thing that they address. He went, she didn't. And then, of course, they're playing around with, well, why didn't you go? And he lied at first about going, and that was your first little playing around with people's expectations.
And the third film does address those questions, and it's very upfront about it, and it's very direct about it. And in a lot of ways, I think it's the least favorite of people who love these trilogies. And in a lot of ways, I think it's the most sophisticated of the 3 films, and it's kind of secretly my favorite. Let me rephrase that. I think Before Midnight is possibly the best film overall of the trilogy, but Before Sunset is my favorite of the trilogy.
I could see that in terms of sophistication and the topics that have to be dealt with, because in the first one, it's just a couple 20-somethings off gallivanting, doing whatever, have a one-night stand, it's all fun and dandy. which is a lot of early relationships in people's lives. Then this film, you've got people who've been in some relationships, they've gone through some stuff, they're a bit more settled in their careers, so now there's some different questions you have to ask in terms of what you're going to do with your life and how the rest of the world around you is going to affect your relationship. And the third one, it's far later in life, now you're affecting the lives of others. How does that all deal in with this relationship that you're having? And it's not always as cut and dry. The older we get, the more complicated our entire lives have become. So, yeah, in those intervening 9 years, what additional stuff is affecting these relationships? And as he said, he has a kid in this one. That's going to become an issue for the next one, 150%.
I don't know how much we want to sort of bring in kind of where things go, or if we want to focus primarily on sort of just talking about Sunset.
Which is a tricky thing.
It kind of is. But I guess my final word on sort of bringing midnight into it is that, you know, this film leaves things in such a way where, much like the first film, you know, it left a lot of questions with people, including the filmmakers. This movie left a lot of questions with people, including the filmmakers, and that's why they chose to revisit with the third film. And it's one of those things where they're really good at covering all the bases. Like they kind of answer most, if not all, of the questions that you would have. They may not do so to your satisfaction, but they're very good at addressing, you know, what about the relationships that they're currently in? What about the amount of time they've known each other and the fact that they're kind of more in love with maybe an idea of themselves than themselves. But
has it been 9 years since Midnight?
It has, and they've talked about Midnight came out in 2013, I believe, and they are
talking about doing Before Next Tuesday.
They were talking about doing the next sort of installment, if that's something that they want to revisit. They don't feel quite as beholden to a timeline because the way Midnight ends, it sort of leaves things off where the Jesse Celine arc is kind of closed. So if they were going to do another trilogy, Jesse and Celine would be a part of it, but it would be sort of tackling it differently. They were very curious to explore Jesse and Celine stuck together during a pandemic.
I'd watch that.
Which was really kind of an interesting idea, but it unfortunately doesn't look like it's going to happen because Julie Delpy, she's pretty burnt out on Hollywood. She's had to sort of fight for a certain degree of recognition and pay equality. Even with these films where she's just as involved as kind of everybody else, but then when she goes to try and, you know, write and direct her own projects, she gets stonewalled. I think she was the least paid member on the Before Trilogy. She's kind of pissed, and she either needs stuff to change, some time to cool off. I mean, it's not fair. It's a broken system, but it would be nice to see these characters come back. I know they have a plan for it. It's just a matter of getting everybody back together and see if that happens. But I want to ask you, I think another reason why Before Sunset is kind of my favorite, it's so lean. It's very tight. It operates on this, you know, there's that deadline of the plane. You've always got this pressure of the plane. The other films don't have the same sort of boxed in sort of nature. Even though you get a lot of real-time moments in them, the films themselves don't operate like this is the next 80 minutes of your life kind of thing. And that isn't even like, it's an artifice of the film, but it's not, or sorry, it's a structure of the film or a framework of the film. I'm trying to find the right word for it. But they don't actually make a big point of it. Like, look at us, we're making a film in real time. Like, it wasn't a selling point. It's just...
it just felt natural.
It's a major story point, but that's it. Because the movie's so tight and so lean and because it operates the way it does, like, how did you feel about the brevity, I guess, of the movie? Was that something that played into it for you?
It didn't feel short. It didn't feel long. It felt just right. It was very Goldilocks. I mean, they even had conversations that had nothing to do with, like, the direct point. They'd talk about nothing. They'd stumble over each other. So it's not like, in theory, you couldn't cut out time and still have all the plot points that you wanted.
Did you feel when they were having those conversations that weren't directly addressing where we are at, do we still like each other, all sort of stuff? It was all relevant and interesting, but you could feel the tension where they're like, we're having small talk, but I really just want to ask you, do you want to get naked with me again?
Absolutely. I was saying that earlier. You feel the sexual tension. You can cut that shit with a knife right off the huff. And you know that he would jump her if they had that opportunity. In fact, I think, didn't he say that like early on, like, where do you want to go? I don't know, is there a hotel around here? Something along those
I think that
lines.
was when he like pulled her onto the bench when they were walking in the park.
Because I know very early on she brought up, I think she was the first person to really bring up that the Frenchmen she's been dating didn't have the sex drive that she really admired in Americans, aka him. And that was a real jumping point after, of course, he was discussing the fact that they actually had sex in the first one. So it was a very prominent topic. It was something that was very obvious. And all the light touches, the bumping into each other, you could feel it.
It's amazing to me also, like there's a line in that film where he tells the story about he was on his way to like a book signing or something. No, his wedding. He was on his way to his wedding and he thought he saw her on the street in New York. And then he found
that she
out
lived there at that time.
in that area. So it very well could have been her. And, you know, this isn't a film where they go into a flashback and they show you like the moment and whatever. It's literally just these two talking heads. But all the drama is still there and you're still feeling like all of it. Like when he says that, like my soul just aches. I mean, cards on the table. I'm a card-carrying, unabashed romantic. Hopeless romantic. So
Sometimes just hopeless.
sometimes just hopeless. But
I too like to consider myself a romantic, not the way it's normally understood. Mostly because I find a lot of things that others call romantic not at all romantic. I've been shouting out for years how Romeo and Juliet is one of the least romantic things ever and how it's ruining the concept of romance for so many people. I hate how romance is treated in film and media. It drives me nuts because I believe in actual romance and people actually getting to know each other and developing deep connections and deep bonds that aren't solely confined to relationships, that it can be friendships that are deeply affectionate, meaningful, and to an extent romantic without sexual aspects. But it's made so cookie cutter and conformist and fed to the masses, and it drives me nuts when there's actual romance out there that can be done with just a look of an eye and a smile out of the corner of your mouth across a crowded room, and you can feel that love, you can feel that connection to people that has nothing to do with all the fluff that we're sold. So I like to think of myself as a romantic, and we'll have to ask my wife whether or not she agrees with me.
probably the last sort of comment I have as far as why I love this film. Paris is a city that I have a really strong connection to, and it's a place that I love being in. And watching these characters going through areas that I'm familiar with, going into areas that I'm not familiar with, and just the city sort of plays a role in the romance of the film. Not in like the smoochy, huggy kind of romance in the film, but in kind of like a classic romanticist sort of way. And when I was in Paris in 2013, which also the year that Before Midnight came out, I was at the Shakespeare and Company bookstore, and I remember being in there and thinking like, I have to see if one of Ethan's books is here. I have to. I have to. And I did find a copy of Ash Wednesday, and I bought a copy of Ash Wednesday there. And I'm hoping one day that I can get Ethan to autograph it to complete the circle. But I do have one of Ethan's books autographed, but not in person. So that was kind of, that just all gets mixed in with the stew that film is for me. And because it's a city that I long for, I long to return to, and I love spending time in. And these characters were characters that I longed for and wanted to see again and want to spend time with. It was the perfect city for me to have these two in, to be experiencing this and to be reconnecting. And so for me, apropos of nothing to do with, I guess, the like structure of the film or the writing of the film specifically, it just really hits me on this emotional level as well. Even though I do think that structure and all that stuff is there and working marvelously. It's a beautifully like clockwork film, but that's, again, just to be transparent.
And I, of course, have the exact opposite opinion of Paris. Everyone who's like, Paris, c'est si romantique. It's the city of love. I roll my eyes so hard that they detach the retinas. Like I just want to slap people all over the place for consumerist marketing, blah, blah, blah. So the location means absolutely nothing in terms of where it's set. They could be walking down somewhere in Romania. They could be walking around somewhere in the East LA slums. Doesn't matter. The fact is, it is a tightly written story that you care about the characters, and it has everything that you might want from a film as long as you're not looking for explosions and extreme action. If you want a drama where you can actually get into the characters, this is a fantastic film for that, and I was extremely surprised when I saw the synopsis and got this out of it. I didn't expect it to be as good as it was.
Paris is not the city of love. It is not the city of lights. Paris is the city of stairs. My experience was I walked up a lot of stairs.
Maybe that's why it's the city of love. Everyone has great asses from all the stairs.
Possibly. Very possibly. Maybe I should go back and...
I like big butts and I cannot lie.
Seeing as how there's no kind of official formal score to this, there's just kind of some random songs that are thrown in. Songs which I really enjoy and loved. But it's all diegetic sound as far as music and whatnot. We don't really have to cover that. I don't really have anything else to add. Do you have anything you want to throw in before we go into the judgment phase?
I do not.
All right.
You know, I think that book that I wrote in a way was like building something so that I wouldn't forget the details of the time that we spent together. You know, like just as a reminder that once we really did meet, you know, that this was real, this happened.
I'm happy you're saying that because, I mean, I always feel like a freak because I'm never able to move on like this, you know. People just have an affair or even entire relationships. They break up and they forget. They move on like they would have changed brand of cereals. I feel I was never able to forget anyone I've been with because each person had their own specific qualities. You can never replace anyone. What is lost is lost. Each relationship, when it ends, really damages me. I never fully recover. That's why I'm very careful with getting involved because it hurts too much. Even getting laid, I actually don't do that because I will miss of the person the most mundane things. Like I'm obsessed with little things. Maybe I'm crazy. When I was a little girl, my mom told me that I was always late to school. One day she followed me to see why. I was looking at chestnuts falling from the trees, rolling on the sidewalk, or ants crossing the road, the way a leaf casts a shadow on a tree trunk. Little things. I think it's the same with people. I see in them little details so specific to each of them that move me and that I miss and will always miss. You can never replace anyone because everyone is made of such beautiful, specific details. Like I remember the way you bid has a bit of red in it and how the sun was making it glow that morning right before you left. I remembered that and I missed it.
So, Before Sunset. Would you rate it a masterpiece or a museum piece, Dustin?
I would call this a masterpiece. The writing, I don't see time getting rid of any of the emotions that anyone might feel, that time is not going to ever date this film. This film's never going to be dated at any point. There's nothing in here that would apply to. And there's so much quality in it that's just going to keep riding on for forever, really. This is a fantastic film today. It was a fantastic film 20 years ago, and it's going to keep being one up until the future.
And does it give you a curiosity to experience the other film?
It did. As soon as I saw it, I was like, I could see Kufre enjoying this, and I kind of want to see all three of them with her. And talking about doing the recording today, I was talking to her again about we should watch these films.
And I also think that, you mentioned how time doesn't change them. The thing that I said earlier about how what changes about them is...
Time changed you.
Yes. Yeah, time changes you, and the way you engage and interact with the films changes. And your opinions on their choices and their behavior. But it doesn't... I don't think... If you get hooked into these films to begin with, I don't think you ever unhook. I don't think you ever go, oh, it jumped the shark. I'm no longer a fan of the Before Trilogy.
It's not going to be like when you're an 8-year-old kid and you enjoyed watching Darkwing Duck and you watch it nowadays and you're like, man, this was garbage. I was an idiot back then.
Let's get dangerous. Man, those 90s, I was never a fan of those like 80s, 90s Disney Channel.
Yeah, well, maybe
Bonkers and
maybe
Darkwing
you weren't
Duck
young
and-
enough to be.
I was all Animaniacs and Tiny Toons. I was very much Warner Brothers oriented. As far as I'm concerned, I do think this film is a masterpiece. For all the same reasons that Dustin said, for all the reasons that we've said over the course of the conversation. It's so tightly paced and scripted, and like it's scripted. This is not improvisational. This is all stuff that's been workshopped extensively. The camera work, the editing is so masterfully executed on such a minimal sort of time and budget. I think they shoot these things in like 2 weeks. Like, they're crazy. They're crazy. And they're wonderful and they're beautiful. And because they have this lasting quality, because they operate on my intellectual level and on my emotional level and everything, I'm definitely going to vote it for a masterpiece. So we are in agreement that 2004's Before Sunset is indeed a masterpiece.
2 check marks.
Yay!
Because we can't do thumbs up. That's copyright.
We can't.
It's a masterpiece.
So that brings us to a close on the conversation for this film. That gives Dustin the next pick. Dustin, what is the next movie on the docket?
The next film on the docket is going to come to us from Africa, which has very little representation in these lists.
Be more
as I
specific than
figured out.
Africa.
Well, I'm using Africa as a generalization.
Okay.
And then going more specific to Senegal, and then even more specific to Simbale Ousmane's Zala from 1975. And I'm surprised, actually, that I remembered not only the title and the director, but the year, and it's been a while since I've looked up any of that. And I know the difference between Africa as a continent and as a country. Come on now. I'd get my ass beat.
To be fair, your partner is Nigerian,
That she is.
so you can't make that same mistake that many people do.
Well, I actively try not to, as I always have.
We may bring it up more in that episode, but that's always been a pet peeve of mine where people just refer to like Africa like a country.
No, I was referring to the continent. The continent itself has very little representation. And
That's true. It does. It very much
there's
does.
about 5 or 6 films from all of Africa on that list.
Even like Egypt? Actually, I have no idea if Egypt... Probably a lot of movies get made in Egypt, but they're not like Egyptian films that we see.
Exactly. And even a couple of them, most of them are done with like France and this country where they were filming here and they just got some film credits or something like that. Something very small. Nothing's really, very little is done from Africa with African directors and African actors. There was certainly one where it was, here's the story of a white woman with a plantation in Africa dealing with whatever civil war going on there. It's like, all right, I wouldn't call that a film from...
I wonder if District 9 makes it on there. I can't remember what year it came out, and he is one of the more high-profile directors to come out of there. I wish I could remember his name for the life of me. I mean, I can name all of his films, like Chappie and Elysium, and yeah.
If only we had a net that sort of intermingles and interconnects the world.
I probably have one of his movies within arm's reach of me at this moment, but we'll leave that for next time. Anyways, so there you go. Next episode, we'll be talking about the Senegalian film Zala, and until then...
Available apparently in its entirety on YouTube for anyone who's interested to check it out beforehand.
In a good way or a bad way? Like, is it...
It's there with subtitles. Also, it's long. Have fun, Mike.
Is it really?
Yeah.
How long is it?
I think it's... Well, I know it's more than 2 hours. It's anywhere between 2 and 3 hours.
Really? Wow. Okay. You kind of said it was like a dramedy, so I thought for sure like maybe 112.
It's a dramedy. And I already know somebody who's seen it. Has good things to say, so we're off to a good start.
All right, cool. So until next time, everybody stay cool, stay safe, stay healthy. I've been your host, Mike Josic,
I've also been your host, Dustin Friesenan.
and we will see you next time on For Your Consideration.
Take care for now.
Island of rain. It was for you just a one-night thing, but you were much more to me, just so you know. I hear
things about you, about all the bad things you do. But when we were together alone, you didn't seem like a player at all. I don't care what they say.